We start with the latest developments around the decision with NFL Sunday Ticket and the verdict there. To do so, we bring in our football writer, Ben Fisher. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Austin, happy to do it.
All right, let's start with the basics here. This was a class action suit brought against the NFL alleging antitrust violations regarding that out-of-market Sunday ticket package that had been on DirecTV for years. Roger Goodell and the NFL rolled the dice on this one. They rolled the dice on a jury trial, and it kind of blew up on them. $4.8 billion in damages, and under antitrust law, that could be tripled to closer to 14 or 15 billion. Not chump change, even for the Shield and its $20 billion a year in revenue. So Ben, how badly did the NFL miscalculate things here?
Well, I don't think it was a miscalculation. I think they knew that a jury was going to be a 50-50 concept at best, and that's probably generous.
Well, usually in that case, they settle early on. Like that's the miscalculation I'm thinking
Right.
about.
Right. It is surprising that they didn't try to settle this because once it got to a trial, I thought, like I said, 50-50 was a generous characterization of the NFL's chances here. Juries aren't necessarily the most sophisticated business minds in the world, but they've got a good sense for sort of intuitive unfairness. And it wasn't difficult to paint a picture of the NFL sort of making sure that people were paying more for this than a true open market competition would have led you to think. I think ultimately at the end of the day, the NFL's position is an extraordinarily high degree of confidence they will ultimately win this on appeal. I think that's tough. It's the Supreme Court. Even getting it to the Supreme Court, they take 1% of all cases that are appealed up to them. They'll likely lose at the Ninth Circuit, which is the West Coast, more liberal-leaning appeals court in the United States, and they already revived this case once.
Generally not pro-business, so yeah, it's going to be tough for the NFL to win out there.
Right. And I think there's every reason to believe the Supreme Court will ultimately bail the NFL out here if they get to the Supreme Court. There's a million different ways things could develop between now and then. That could be years from now. So simply saying you're going to eventually win doesn't necessarily mean it makes sense to go to trial. But they did. And the jury decided that pooling 32 teams' out-of-market media rights and selling them collectively to a single exclusive distributor is an illegal restraint of trade. And if you raise your eyebrows at that because you say, wait, isn't that how a lot of sports properties do business?
Mm-hmm.
You would be right to. And that's the real thing. As big as the money is here in this case, the money is really the sideshow to the possible precedents this sets that it's against the law to collectively sell media rights to a single league, because for decades, that's been one of the primary purposes of the NFL is to consolidate and roll up media rights held by 32 separate businesses. So the potential for the precedent is at least as big as the money. And I don't mean to downplay the money. They're both huge stories.
Well, our next date to watch for is July 31st. That's where the NFL is going to argue that the judgment that came from the jury in this case was excessive. They're going to ask the judge in that case to set it aside. Like you said, if that fails, it's on to the Ninth Circuit. And then whatever side loses, whether it's the NFL or the plaintiffs here, they're going to try to get the Supreme Court to take this up. I think if you're reading between the lines on some comments from somebody like Justice Brett Kavanaugh, he's a person that wants to see this sort of thing come to the court. So I do think there is a good chance that the court does take it up. Either way, likely a number of years in legal purgatory here. The lawyers are going to be big winners, racking up billable hours. And if the NFL does appeal, like you said, it's going to need to pony up a pretty hefty bond here, maybe as much as the full $14 billion. Is that something that's going to be equally shared among owners? Because like David Tepper and Virginia McCaskey aren't on the same level as far as net worth goes. And does this impact something like revenue sharing with the players?
Right. Well, it doesn't impact revenue sharing. Revenue sharing is sharing of revenue, not of legal risk. So this is on the owners. This wouldn't decrease a salary cap absent some special arrangement with the union, which I suppose now that I think about it, I haven't actually asked about, but I don't see why the PA would be interested in helping bail them out on this. This is an ownership problem, I'm sure, as far as they see it. But I should ask that question. And it would be shared equally. Part of the principle of the NFL sharing revenue and being so socialistic among owners, they share obligations too. Again, there's always room for waivers and special conversations to bail out some of the more cash poor owners. But the strong starting presumption here would be is that you divide this verdict or that bond by 32, and each owner would share in their part of it.
I got to say, Ben, this is a case I wish that I had kind of when I was in law school. It's something we could have addressed in our sports law class because it really is fascinating from a sports and antitrust case. If this does get taken up by the Supreme Court, the law that's going to be in focus is that Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961. But that was only meant to protect broadcast deals at the time. You only had 3 networks. And based on the language of that, cable TV wasn't really envisioned, so it might not necessarily be covered. Streaming, obviously, on something like Amazon or YouTube TV, which currently has that Sunday ticket package, that definitely wasn't envisioned. That Sunday ticket deal is worth $2 billion a year now to the NFL. It seems like it's just a major threat to the NFL's cash cow and every league's cash cow, like you alluded to. Like, you know, if you're the NBA and you have an Amazon deal, you're the Big Ten, you have an Amazon deal. So there are probably a lot of leagues and conferences that are sweating right now.
That's one of the reasons this would be such a great case study for a law school class, because it is the ultimate illustration of how there's the law and then there's business practical realities. And sometimes those things aren't the same thing. I mean, one of the things the NFL might bring up on July 31st with his post-trial hearing with the judge in LA is asking for a chance to do something strategically of their own volition that would pass muster. You know, maybe we say we keep the deal with YouTube, but now we're going to start selling individual team deals as Sunday ticket. Maybe that lowers our exposure going forward. There's both the actual verdict and what they need to do to avoid further antitrust jeopardy. And those are not necessarily bright lines, win or lose the Supreme Court questions. Those are questions of the NFL's business risk, their interest, the team's interest in how much they want to work together versus work alone. So there's a lot of different ways this could go. And, you know, I don't mean to be dramatic, but this should have everybody who's selling rights at a collective level at least ask the question, are we next? Sure, there's going to be a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys who think, well, if we got this jury verdict, we can get others in similar cases, even if they're not exactly the same as Sunday ticket. One other thing about the, you know, what else might come into play here in an appellate level. The 1961 Sports Broadcasting Act is a big thing, and exactly how far that goes. But there's something pretty obscure here that I learned in the process of covering this case. Was a precedent from the 70s in Illinois that said indirect purchasers of a product cannot sue for antitrust violations. And one of the lawyers I spoke with last week after this verdict said that is the original sin of the Ninth Circuit in allowing this case to proceed to begin with. That the people who buy Sunday ticket are buying from DirecTV in this case, who bought the rights from NFL, so that it is on its face wrong for those customers to have an antitrust action against the NFL. That may be the simplest way for the NFL to win on appeal. So don't sleep on that. That would eliminate a lot of these other issues.
That's obviously, I think, something the NFL is going to lean on very heavily if it does decide to appeal that. But Ben, that July 31st day, that's the next thing to pay attention to. Then obviously a couple years of legal limbo depending on who comes out on top on that. I know you're going to be staying on top of it as we move forward. Ben Fisher, SBJ's resident football expert, thanks for joining the pod.
Sure thing, Austin.